April 21, 2025. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica toll not in celebration, but in mourning. A silence falls over Vatican City, but it carries the weight of 1 billion hearts. The world has lost a shepherd. A reformer. A man whose quiet strength echoed louder than most voices of power. Pope Francis, the first pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit pontiff, the first in over a millennium to choose the name of the Saint of Humility, has passed away at the age of 88. But this isn't just the end of a life. It's the close of a chapter unlike any in modern church history. From his first appearance on the balcony in 2013, when he simply said, "Buona sera," and bowed to the crowd, Pope Francis made it clear, this would be a different kind of papacy. Tonight, we honor his life, reflect on his mission, and explore the legacy he leaves not just to the Catholic Church, but to the world. This is the story of a man who redefined the throne of St. Peter by refusing to sit too high above the people he served. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born on December 17, 1936, in the modest neighborhood of Flores, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He was the eldest of 5 children, raised in a small home by Italian immigrant parents. His father, a railway worker, and his mother, a homemaker, taught him the values that would guide his entire life: humility, service, and faith. Even as a boy, Bergoglio was different. Quiet. Observant. Deeply empathetic. While other children played, he listened, to people, to silence, to his conscience. He loved soccer and tango, but he also spent time in the parish, fascinated by the rituals and the sense of meaning the church brought to daily life. He studied chemistry in his youth, earning a technician's degree, and even held a job in a laboratory. But something deeper was stirring, a sense of calling that science couldn't answer. In 1958, he entered the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, a religious order known for its intellectual rigor, spiritual discipline, and fierce commitment to the poor and marginalized. His formation was marked by suffering and growth. As a young seminarian, he lost a lung to a severe infection, an event that nearly ended his journey before it began. But it only deepened his resilience. In 1969, he was ordained a priest, and quickly stood out for his quiet charisma and deep compassion. He taught literature and psychology. He led spiritual retreats. But most of all, he walked among the people. He declined special privileges, took public buses, and visited slums. His sermons were not lofty theology but human reflections, full of warmth, struggle, and grace. In 1992, Pope John Paul II appointed him auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires. 6 years later, he became archbishop of the city. There, he gained a reputation for being a bishop of the people, frequently seen praying with the homeless, ministering to AIDS patients, and calling out systemic injustice. He lived in a small apartment, cooked his own meals, and eschewed the trappings of power. He was often seen kneeling to wash the feet of the poor, years before it would become a global symbol of his papacy. In 2001, he was named cardinal. And still, he remained understated. During his visits to Rome, he refused luxury accommodations, preferring a simple room at the clergy house. Then came 2013. With the unexpected resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, the Church found itself at a crossroads. And in a surprise decision during the conclave, the cardinals turned to a man from the global south. A Jesuit. A reformer. A shepherd. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio emerged onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, the world held its breath. Dressed in plain white, he bowed his head and asked for the people's blessing before offering his own. With the humble greeting, "Buona sera," the world met Pope Francis. In that moment, history shifted, not just in the Church, but in how leadership could look, not from above, but from beside. Pope Francis did not just take on a new title in 2013, he embodied a new way of being Pope. From the very beginning, his gestures signaled a dramatic shift in tone, message, and mission. He declined the opulent apostolic palace, choosing instead the guesthouse Casa Santa Marta. He rejected the bulletproof Pope Mobile in favor of a modest Fiat or Ford. He dined in the common cafeteria with Vatican staff. These choices were not PR stunts, they were theological statements. Statements about proximity. About poverty. About power. When asked why he chose the name Francis, he replied that it was in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, the man of the poor, the man of peace, the man who loved and protected creation. That choice became a mission statement. He shattered traditions without losing reverence. On Holy Thursday, he washed the feet of inmates, including Muslims and women, acts that were unheard of for popes before him. He embraced the sick, the disfigured, the marginalized, sometimes with no words, just touch. He spoke constantly about mercy. His first major document was titled The Joy of the Gospel, Not the Strictness of Law. He emphasized inclusion over exclusion, saying the church is not a toll booth, but a home for all. He criticized what he called airport bishops, career clergy more invested in prestige than pastoral work. He spoke openly against clericalism, materialism, and the temptation to turn faith into ideology. He warned church leaders not to become administrators of structures, but true shepherds. He invited atheists to dialogue. He told a young boy whose dog had died, "Paradise is open to all of God's creatures." He allowed room for ambiguity in conversations on sexuality, gender, and modern family life, without compromising church doctrine, but also without coldness. His papacy was marked by listening. By walking with people instead of preaching at them. By acknowledging doubt, brokenness, and complexity in a rapidly changing world. To many, he became a spiritual father, not because he demanded it, but because he reflected it. And in his face, many saw something divine, not distant, not untouchable, but deeply, recognizably human. He once said, "The shepherd should smell like the sheep." Pope Francis lived that. And the church, for a time, smelled more like the streets, and more like Christ. Beneath the gentle demeanor of Pope Francis was a determined reformer, one who saw not only spiritual renewal as his mission, but institutional repair. When he stepped into the Vatican in 2013, he inherited more than a church in spiritual crisis. He inherited an institution plagued by scandals, financial corruption, sexual abuse cover-ups, and deep-rooted bureaucracy that had become resistant to change. Francis didn't waste time. His first order of business was to reform the Roman Curia, the centuries-old governing body of the Church. He established the Council of Cardinals, a team of advisors from every continent, to decentralize decision-making and bring diverse voices into the heart of Vatican governance. He launched a complete overhaul of the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. The bank, long associated with secrecy and scandal, became a focal point of his transparency campaign. Audits were mandated, shady accounts were closed, and new financial ethics were introduced, something unheard of in modern papal history. He also addressed clerical sexual abuse with unprecedented candor. He met with survivors, apologized on behalf of the Church, and created the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. While critics argued his actions didn't go far enough, others hailed him as the first pope to truly listen, and act, with moral clarity. But reform in the Vatican is not like passing laws in a democracy. It's more like steering a massive ship through centuries of tradition and internal politics. And Francis faced fierce opposition. From conservative bishops who feared theological erosion to entrenched figures who resented the disruption of power, he was often isolated in his mission. He called the Curia a sick body, in one of his most famous Christmas addresses, a rebuke that sent shockwaves through the Holy See. Still, he pressed forward. He streamlined diocesan structures, emphasized synodality, a model of church governance based on listening and dialogue, and insisted that leadership return to the foundational principles of service and humility. He was not afraid to use blunt language. He condemned careerism, spiritual narcissism, and clerical elitism. He spoke of a church that must go out into the peripheries, not just geographically, but spiritually, to reach those abandoned or forgotten. His reforms weren't just about rules, they were about culture. He sought to change how bishops lead, how priests relate to their people, how the Vatican views power. And though many of his reforms may take generations to be fully realized, Pope Francis reawakened something essential, the idea that the Church is a living body, and like all living things, it must be pruned in order to bear fruit. He reminded the world that even the oldest institutions must evolve. And that the Spirit of Christ must never be confined to marble walls. While Pope Francis was reshaping the internal structures of the Church, his voice began to resonate far beyond the Vatican walls. He emerged not just as a spiritual leader for Catholics, but as a global conscience for the modern world. He was the first pope to address the U.S. Congress and the European Parliament not as a statesman, but as a moral voice. In those speeches, he didn't speak in abstractions, he spoke of the poor, the migrant, the unborn, the prisoner, and the planet. And he did so with clarity, courage, and compassion. When he released the encyclical Laudato Si in 2015, it was a watershed moment, not just for the Church, but for the global environmental movement. In it, he framed care for creation as a moral responsibility, condemning what he called the throwaway culture of modern consumerism. Scientists, activists, and policymakers, many of whom had never paid attention to papal writings, suddenly found themselves quoting the Pope. He visited the peripheries of the world, not the capitals, but the margins. In Myanmar, he stood in solidarity with the Rohingya. In the Central African Republic, he opened the holy door of mercy in a war zone. In Lesbos, he embraced Syrian refugees, reminding the world that behind every statistic is a soul. He was never afraid to name injustice. He condemned arms trafficking, human trafficking, and economic systems that prioritized profit over dignity. He criticized both unchecked capitalism and lifeless bureaucracy, calling instead for an economy that puts people first. And when others built walls, he called for bridges. Build bridges, not walls, became one of the most repeated themes of his global ministry. But perhaps his greatest global gift was the reminder that faith and justice are not separate paths. For Pope Francis, prayer and protest could walk hand in hand. He showed the world that holiness is not only found in silence and ritual, but also in marching for peace, feeding the hungry, and protecting the earth. He did not seek applause. He sought awareness. Transformation. Conversion, not just of the heart, but of the systems that shape human life. In a time of rising populism and tribalism, his message was radical in its simplicity: we are all brothers and sisters. And in this message, spoken not just in words but in deeds, Pope Francis became not just a Catholic leader, but a global voice for justice, echoing across faiths, borders, and generations. No leader, no matter how beloved or visionary, can escape the weight of challenge. And Pope Francis, for all his humility and daring compassion, found his path marked by resistance, misunderstanding, and controversy. The very things that made him so revolutionary to some, his warmth, his openness, his pastoral approach, were perceived by others as dangerous deviations from orthodoxy. From the earliest years of his papacy, conservative factions, especially within the Roman Curia and among clergy in Europe and North America, voiced unease. His pastoral flexibility regarding divorced and remarried Catholics, and his suggestion that LGBTQ+ individuals deserved respect and welcome, sparked intense theological debate. While he never changed church doctrine, his emphasis on inclusion, tone, and mercy was seen by critics as doctrinal slippage. They accused him of fostering ambiguity, of undermining moral clarity, of bending too far in the name of modernity. The word mercy, so central to his papacy, became a lightning rod, celebrated by the hopeful, and weaponized by the fearful. And there were political storms. Francis's critiques of unbridled capitalism and his plea for economic systems rooted in human dignity did not sit well with some global leaders. His encyclical Laudato Si, which called for urgent ecological reform, was praised by environmentalists but dismissed by climate change skeptics as overreach. In the United States, his advocacy for immigrant rights, his rebuke of xenophobia, and his resistance to nationalistic rhetoric earned him admiration from progressives, but drew scorn from more conservative circles. He was called a globalist, a socialist, even, at times, a heretic. Inside the Vatican, his reform efforts met institutional inertia. Decades, centuries, of tradition do not shift easily. The very machinery he sought to transform pushed back. Confidential documents were leaked. Resistance mounted behind closed doors. The so-called Vatileaks 2.0 scandal revealed internal discord and plots to discredit him. In one of his boldest moments, during the traditional Christmas address to the Roman Curia in 2014, he publicly listed 15 spiritual diseases afflicting the Church's hierarchy: careerism, spiritual Alzheimer's, vanity, hypocrisy. It was not a gentle rebuke. It was a declaration of battle. But perhaps the most painful and complex cross he bore was the Church's long struggle with sexual abuse. Pope Francis made unprecedented moves, creating commissions for victim protection, revising canon law to improve accountability, removing bishops and cardinals implicated in scandals. He met with survivors face to face, listening to their trauma with tears and silence. And yet, for many, it still wasn't enough. There were high-profile failures, like the initial defense of Chilean Bishop Juan Barros, later acknowledged by Francis as a grave error. And the 2018 open letter by Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, accusing the Pope of ignoring abuse by former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, created a firestorm of doubt and division, even though the claims were widely contested. The abuse crisis was a wound that refused to heal quickly. Francis carried it, not only as a pope, but as a priest, and often in solitude. He called the Church to repentance, but repentance is a long road, and he walked it slowly, sometimes painfully. Through all these storms, doctrinal, political, moral, he rarely responded with anger. He responded with presence. He chose listening over retaliation, witness over defense. He absorbed criticism with prayer and, as many observed, with growing physical weariness. In one of his final public reflections, he said, "Let us not be afraid of the truth, for truth sets us free. But let us speak it with love." Francis knew the truth was not always welcomed, nor easily carried. But he bore it. Because for him, leadership was not about being admired, it was about being faithful. In the final years of his life, Pope Francis aged gently, but with deep resolve. His steps grew slower. His voice more graveled. The visible signs of wear appeared: a wheelchair, oxygen support, and cancelled overseas trips. Yet none of this slowed his spiritual fire. As his body weakened, his message only grew stronger. He once joked, "I have the mind of a young man and the knees of an old one." And even as he accepted physical limitations, he refused to retreat into ceremonial comfort. He remained present, writing, preaching, praying, guiding. Between 2022 and 2025, he continued to meet heads of state, survivors of violence, and children from war-torn countries. He issued encyclicals, presided over masses in a wheelchair, and even traveled short distances to uplift refugee communities, always choosing presence over retreat. But the signs were clear. In 2023, his bronchial infections worsened. By 2024, doctors restricted his travel almost entirely. His public appearances became fewer, more intimate. The world began to brace. Yet it was also in these years that Francis gave his most personal, vulnerable teachings. He spoke often of death, not with fear, but with familiarity. "I am preparing to meet the Lord," he said in a 2024 homily. "And I want to meet him standing, if I can, but ready, even if on my knees." In a handwritten letter shared with close aides, he updated his funeral plans. No grand tomb under St. Peter's. No gold casket. He requested burial in Santa Maria Maggiore, beneath the image of the Virgin Mary that had accompanied him on every apostolic mission. There, he had often slipped in quietly to pray before dawn. There, he would rest, quietly, permanently. In March 2025, Francis was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital with severe pneumonia. Vatican updates were minimal. Whispers grew. Cardinals flew in discreetly. Priests around the world began preparing special masses. Then, on April 21, Easter Monday, the day of resurrection, he suffered a massive cerebral stroke at 2:38 a.m. He never regained consciousness. Doctors confirmed his heart stopped at 8:45 p.m. He was 88 years old. But what made headlines wasn't just his death. It was the detail whispered from his bedside, that his final words, spoken faintly as he drifted into coma, were, "Jesus, forgive. Jesus, receive." The next morning, the world awoke to mourning. Across 5 continents, cathedrals rang solemn bells. Pilgrims lit candles in Buenos Aires, Manila, Krakow, and Kinshasa. Leaders from all faiths offered condolences, not out of duty, but deep respect. On social media, one image went viral, a black-and-white photo of young Father Jorge Bergoglio, grinning wide among shoeless children in the slums of Villa 31. It wasn't a staged portrait, it was life. Real, messy, beautiful. Just like his ministry. And so, as dusk fell over Rome and the bells of St. Peter's echoed across the city, the world didn't just lose a pope. It lost a father. A pilgrim. A man who led not with grandeur, but with grace. He did not ascend a throne. He walked a path. And now, that path is ours to continue. The news of Pope Francis's passing echoed far beyond the Vatican walls. It was not merely a religious event, it was a global moment of stillness. In St. Peter's Square, the silence was almost sacred. Thousands gathered with candles, rosaries, and handwritten notes. Many wept. Some prayed aloud. Others simply stood still, unsure how to say goodbye to a man who had, in many ways, been the moral voice of a generation. Across the globe, bells rang from Manila to Madrid, from Cape Town to Calgary. World leaders issued statements that transcended protocol. President Joe Biden called him a moral compass in an age of confusion. The United Nations observed a moment of silence. Leaders from Orthodox, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist communities expressed deep sorrow, not just for the Catholic Church, but for humanity. In Argentina, his homeland, people poured into churches. In the slums of Buenos Aires, where he once walked as a young priest, murals began to appear overnight, "Gracias, Francisco." In Rio de Janeiro, thousands gathered for a candlelight vigil on Copacabana Beach. In the Philippines, entire city blocks paused to pray the rosary. Major newspapers ran black banners. Television networks suspended programming for live coverage. Social media became a river of grief and gratitude. Hashtags like #PopeFrancis, #GraciasPapa, and #HumbleRevolutionary trended globally for days. But it wasn't just the famous who spoke. It was the forgotten. A refugee camp in Jordan held a mass in his honor. Former inmates in Italy's prisons wrote prayers for his soul. A homeless man in Chicago told a reporter, "He made us feel seen. Like we mattered." In Iraq, Yazidi women who had once been enslaved by ISIS remembered how Francis had embraced them during his 2021 pilgrimage. "He looked in our eyes," one said. "He cried with us." In China, where Catholics often worship underground, secret vigils were held in silence. In Ukraine, soldiers lit candles in muddy trenches. In sub-Saharan Africa, children carried pictures of the Pope during school processions. And in war zones, disaster areas, and border camps, people gathered, not to analyze theology, but to remember a man who brought hope. At the Vatican, preparations for his funeral began. But there was no rush. The world was not ready to let him go just yet. And as the crowd in St. Peter's Square continued to grow, the candles multiplied, until the night itself seemed to glow with quiet love. The Church had lost its shepherd. The world had lost a voice of conscience. But in that collective mourning, something else emerged, a global memory. A shared silence. A final blessing that stretched across nations. He had lived simply. He had died humbly. And now, the world grieved greatly. With the passing of Pope Francis, the Catholic Church now stands at a profound crossroads. In the coming days, the College of Cardinals, comprising 135 members under the age of 80, will convene in Rome for what is known as the sede vacante period. During this time, the day-to-day operations of the Church continue, but the seat of Peter remains empty. The Apostolic Palace goes dark. Vatican City slows. And the world watches. The cardinals will enter the Sistine Chapel for the conclave, a sacred and secretive election where, through prayer, debate, and the casting of ballots, a new pope will be chosen. No one knows who it will be. But the questions they must face are clear. Will they continue the reforms Francis began, or pivot back toward more traditional structures? Will they choose someone from the global south again, or return to Europe? Will the next pope be a pastor, a professor, a bridge builder, or something unexpected? The stakes are immense. The Church today is both expanding and splintering, growing rapidly in Africa and Asia, while struggling in parts of Europe and North America. Francis's pontificate inspired millions, but also revealed deep divides. And yet, within that tension lies opportunity. The conclave is not merely about preserving continuity, it is about seeking courage. The kind of courage that Francis embodied when he stepped out on that balcony in 2013 and chose not power, but simplicity. In the meantime, the Vatican prepares for his funeral. Dignitaries will arrive. Masses will be held. Mourners will pass by his casket. But within the stillness, one message remains. The Church mourns, but it does not stop. It remembers, but it also chooses. And as the white smoke of the next election rises, one can only hope that whoever walks onto that balcony next will carry forward the legacy of the man who chose mercy, simplicity, and truth. The world turns its eyes to Rome. And once more, waits for a whisper of God's will. He never wore a crown. He carried a cross. He never sought to be exalted. He knelt. He never demanded attention. And yet the whole world listened. Pope Francis redefined greatness, not through titles or thrones, but through gestures, a kiss on a forehead, a tear shared with the broken, a whispered prayer in silence. He taught us that strength lives in tenderness. That truth can speak softly. And that to lead is to serve. Now, his voice is quiet. But his legacy lives, in the hearts of the poor, the hopes of the wounded, and the memory of a church made more human because he walked among it. And so we say goodbye, not just to a pope, but to a man who showed the world what it means to walk in the footsteps of Christ. May his journey now be light. May his rest now be peace. And may the world never forget the echo of a voice that once said, "Pray for me." Tonight, we do. Amen.